So hi, I'm Bobby Kimbrough, and welcome to Off the Cuffs. I'm excited today to have with me my friend, Mr. Dave Plyler, who is the chairman of the Forsyth County Commissioners. I'm grateful that you're here. I've been looking forward to you coming. We've been talking so much offline that I forgot to start talking online. First of all, I want to welcome you here to Off the Cuffs, and I want to say publicly, I thank you for the support that you, especially you and the board, have given me, all the advice that you've given me and everything that you do to make this county better. I want you to start from the beginning and tell, because you were telling me some interesting stories that I want, some of them I want to repeat, but I want people to know who you are. Are you from Winston? Tell us where you're from and just tell me about you. I know that, First of all, I want to thank you for your service because you were in the Air Force. Exactly. I remember that. Yeah.
Well, first of all, let me tell you I'm grateful to be here.
Oh.
And I'm tickled to death to have you as sheriff of Forsyth County.
Thank you.
Because from a personal point of view, we need a man of your caliber. You just happen to be, in my mind, the right man for the right job at the right time.
I appreciate that.
But as for me, I was born in Orange, California.
Wow.
My dad was a traveling salesman, and I lived in Orange for a while when I was a baby, and then we moved to La Habra, and then we moved to Santa Ana, and then we moved to Laguna Beach. And Laguna Beach, at that time, had one house on the beach in Southern California. Mm-hmm. This is back in the early 40s. We lived in the house, and we had military people marching up and down in front of our doors carrying loaded weapons because they were waiting for the Japanese to come out from underneath the ocean and attack somewhere in the Laguna Beach area. It never happened, but my dad got homesick, so we moved back to North Carolina. My grandmother lived in Monroe in Union County.
Yeah, Union County.
And my daddy was raised on a farm, so he was at home when we got there. But there are two things I learned when I came to North Carolina from California. And this, understand now, when we came back here, we arrived in North Carolina by train, not by aircraft, in 1948. Wow. And on the way back, I was a young guy, 10 years old, and I'd look out the window. That was a fascinating thing for me. But when we went through New Orleans, I saw a little old black lady, and she had a bucket, and she was going around, and I thought picking up rocks. And my mother said, no, she's picking up coal from the coal car, and she'll take that back, and that's how they warm their homes down there. And I had never heard that before. Learned a lot.
Yeah.
So we ended up in Monroe, and we lived on Beasley Street, right in front of the Chevrolet dealership, and just a half a block over from the railroad tracks. And the first person I met was a little black guy. Mm-hmm. And you got to understand, I had no idea in what the societal way was at that time, because when I was in California in the first grade, I went to school with Asians, went to school with people from Japan, believe it or not, blacks, Mexicans, Hispanics from other areas. So, I mean, that was the way the California system was set up. Everybody lived there, so that's how I lived. But the first friend I made was a black kid. And one day he told me, he said, I can't play with you anymore. And I said, well, why? And I was about 11 years old, and he said, because you're white. I said, what difference does that make? He said, my mama just says I can't do it, so I can't play with you anymore. That's where I learned about segregation, big time.
You were here in the South then?
I was in Monroe, Union County. And my best friend, the only guy I knew, told me he couldn't play with me anymore. So I felt the problem, and I began to learn as I went along until I got out of high school, got out of college. But all of that benefited me. I met a girl who lived on a farm, tobacco farm in Julian, North Carolina, which is between Greensboro and Liberty.
Exactly.
And she knew how to cook, she knew how to sew, she knew how to do everything. So when we married, I didn't have to worry about how much money I was making because she could cook, she could sew, and we just had a wonderful time then and for the rest of our lives together. And then we had two daughters, both of whom are school teachers today, teaching. One teaches children with special needs. That would be children in, say, group homes. Mm-hmm. And some of these kids, they just don't know any better. They throw food on you. They do things that we would say shouldn't be done. But if you'd have told me my daughter would be teaching children like that, I'd say there's no way. But she does, and she does a good job. My other daughter teaches K through 3 reading, and she has a master's degree in teaching children how to read.
Wow.
And that we get into politics there, but when I say politics, the General Assembly, in my opinion, certainly doesn't do all the job they should do with education, and especially with teachers. And that's why when I became a county commissioner, my top priority is to make sure teachers were paid
Right.
what they're worth. Well,
I agree with you.
I'll give you an example. Thank you, sir.
Definitely.
But I'll give you an example. The General Assembly, in their wisdom, decided the kids in the third grade can't read. So we've got to do something about that. And if you have a master's degree in reading, teaching children how to read, we'll pay you $10,000 a year more. That's a great idea. Tickled me to death. My daughter got a $10,000 raise, which lasted 3 years. The General Assembly, for some reason or another, politics, in my opinion, pulled it back. So my daughter took a $10,000 hit because the General Assembly said, kids can read and we don't need to worry about that, which today still isn't true. But it was at that point my daughter had an offer from virtual schools, which is a whole different world. So she was teaching kids to read.
Was that going to school online? Virtual?
Online. It's all computers.
Yeah.
She and my younger daughter had 96 students, and still do, between Murphy and Matteo in North Carolina. And that's just virtual school. So when the opportunity came, the Board of Commissioners agreed that we need to pay. We're already paying the teacher a supplement. And the reason we have a supplement is because the General Assembly simply didn't then and still doesn't pay teachers enough money. You're going to get an argument on that, but I disagree with that. So we've gotten that to the point where we had a quarter of a penny increase for teachers on the sales tax, which in my opinion was a fair tax, primarily because sales taxes, if anybody comes in here from Guilford, Davie, Davidson, wherever, and they buy a bottle of pop, a quarter penny sales tax is there, and they're helping to support the pay raise for the teachers. But the pay raise that we passed this past March affected all of the teachers in our system, and the school board will be the elected body who will see how much money each teacher is going to get. But on average, it'll be between $2,000 and $3,000 a year, which is not a lot of money, but it needs to be done.
So let me ask you a question. When you and I were talking, you were telling me that you were in the military and you were naming, you did 4 years, you told me, right, in the military?
Yes, sir, sure was.
Air Force.
Yeah, Air Force.
So out of college you went into the Air Force or you went out of high school?
No, I'll tell you, I was a student. Now, there's a story there, too. I have a lot of stories.
Well, you know what? You're full of wealth and knowledge. And you know what? One of the reasons I wanted you here was because you have so much history. You were telling me about Woolworth. You were telling me about the incident as a reporter. And it's so much. I mean, you are a influencer in this. You have power here. You have knowledge. And I wanted you to share that because there's so much history that you have that most of us don't even remember. When you're talking about a train ride in 1948,
that's right.
Most of us can't even comprehend that.
Oh, if you'd have told me you could put 500 people on an airplane and take off, I'd say all they're going to do is sit there because you can't take off with 500 people on board. But they did, and they still do. Yeah. But no, in the military, that's an area where President Truman integrated the military. So you do.
So why'd you go in the military? But anyway, thank you for your service. What prompted you, from California to Monroe, to decide to go in the military?
Well, first of all, I was in broadcasting. I was a disc jockey back in the mid-'50s.
Okay.
And I loved the job. I mean, who else is going to get paid for doing exactly what you and I are doing?
Talking.
And then I can play a record and sit there and enjoy it. I had a program at 10 o'clock at night called Music for Lovers Only. And there was an eatery in Greensboro called The Boar and Castle. And that's where all the teens went to park under the tree, in the shade, in the dark, and make out. We called it making out. Yeah. And they'd turn the radio on. And because I was one of them, I was the number one disc jockey for that time period in the community at that time. And as a result, I had a great rapport with all of the recruiters, Army, Air Force, Navy. They knew what was going on before anybody else did. And the guy called me one day and he said, David, you're going to be drafted October 1st.
That's right, because the draft, I forgot about it. I'm living in these times. It's the draft, that's right.
Well, October 1st, I said, look, is it the Army? He says, that's exactly where you're going to go. And I said, well, what if I don't want to go in the Army? What if I want to? He says, well, you better hurry. So I go to see the Air Force recruiter, And the Air Force recruiter says, we can get you in before October 1st, so don't worry about it. And they did. But the reason I went into the Air Force is primarily because the Air Force recruiter, this is the truth now, he said, now, you understand when you go in the Air Force, we fly, which means you're not going to go head-to-head in combat with the enemy. I said, you're serious? I won't have to go into combat? Yeah, but you probably face him in the sky. And I thought, well, that's even worse, having to drop 50,000 feet. But I went in the Air Force, and I was specialized in 3 areas. One was Armed Forces, radio, and television. The other was military air transport service. We hauled a lot of furniture and stuff for military people back and forth across the Pacific. And the third was passenger service, which is just what it says. We put all the people that wanted to go, space available or otherwise, on an aircraft, and that's where they went. So we specialized for the big airplanes like a C-124 Globemaster and the T-33 jet trainer, but passengers couldn't go in those. But the big aircraft, they did. And I was sent to a number of places, and I learned a lot. But that's what I did for a living in the military. But all of that was a learning experience, too.
Wow.
I thought I was sent to Scott Air Force Base because that's where the headquarters for the Military Air Command was located, which means all the big air transports came out of Scott Air Force Base, which is in Belleville and right across the river from St. Louis. And my squadron commander happened to be a guy named Matthew Ridgely. He drove a pink Pontiac convertible. Black guy, had a girlfriend in St. Louis. Well, just an aside, let's go over here. I go to Main Street Methodist Church in Kernersville, and there's a black guy who came in from Cary named Cliff. And Cliff started talking to me about his time in the Air Force at Scott Air Force Base 40 years ago. And I said, well, what did you do at Scott Air Force Base? And he told me it turned out we were both in the same squadron and didn't know each other until 40 years later when we met in church.
That's amazing.
It is amazing. And he said, who was your commanding officer? I said, Captain Matthew Ridgely. He says, that was my commanding officer. He says he was killed in a wreck on the way back from St. Louis. I said, yeah, that's the same one. So, I mean, all of that stuff just kind of meshes for me, and it's been a great experience. I was sent from Clark Air Base to Francis E. Warren Air Force Base in Cheyenne, Wyoming, which is a missile base, and my job was to manifest crews on helicopters going out to the missile sites.
Yes.
Turned out they had the missile sites, but they didn't have any helicopters, so I ended up doing something else in the air transportation, but I had a good time in the military.
So what brought you into politics? I ask myself that sometimes too.
That's a good story there, too.
I want to hear it.
When Mr. Gray owned at that time it was WSJS Television, Winston-Salem Journal-Sentinel.
The newspaper.
Yes, sir. And it went into it, and he owned it all, lock, stock, and barrel. And in 1954, Channel 12 went on the air, and I arrived at Channel 12 in 1960 and stayed for a few months and then went in the Air Force. And then I got out in 65, but the law says if you're employed by WSJS, when you go in, they've got to take you back, which they did. And they put me in the radio division where I played records. I was a disc jockey. But I wanted to get into the news business, and we had news on Channel 12 in its infancy, and we had professional people who knew what they were doing. So
Channel 12 and the Journal and Sentinel,
all the same.
Really?
Mr. Gray owned it all. Mr. Gray owned WSJS Radio, AM, WSJS FM, which is now WTQR, WSJS Television, which is now WXII. He owned the Journal, the Winston-Salem Journal, the afternoon paper, the Sentinel, and later he owned the cable system. And there's nothing else to own. He owned it all until...
I never knew that.
Oh, yeah.
I always thought that, and I'm probably going to show my ignorance. I probably shouldn't say it because somebody's going to say, God, you didn't know that. I always thought that Channel 12 was owned by an affiliate of NBC.
Yeah, it was. What happened was the Federal Communications Commission came in and said, on a broad rule affecting everybody in the country, it especially affected Gordon Gray, you cannot own a big daily newspaper like the Winston-Salem Journal and a television station because you got a monopoly. So you're going to have to sell one or the other. Mr. Gray chose to sell the Journal and the Sentinel to Media General in Richmond, Virginia. And then he chose to sell Channel 12 to multimedia in Greenville, South Carolina. Well, what happened when they sold to Greenville, South Carolina? Greenville, South Carolina, multimedia also owned the big newspaper in Greenville. They also owned the big television station in Greenville. They owned a television station in Asheville. And they told multimedia, now look, here's the deal. If you want to buy Channel 12, you've got to do twice as much news and public affairs as anybody else in the area, because it's just not fair. You'd have too much influence. You know, I mean, you talk about Asheville, and Greenville goes into Charlotte, and then we go into Charlotte, so it makes sense. Yeah. But to do that, you've got to have a budget, and it's going to cost a lot of money. So who was around who had been on television, and that's what I did. I was on television a lot, but pick Plyler, because all we have to do is pay him a salary. We don't have to pay him as a department head or anything else. So my job was to protect the license of the television station.
Okay.
So we had to put programs on that appealed to the broad spectrum of the public. So I had a program that was produced by a fellow named Doug Bales. We called it Scrunch, and it targeted 3 to 6 year olds. Then I had a program for teenagers called Teen Talk. And I got Glenn Scott, who was the weatherman at that time for Channel 12, to do it. He came from WTOB, and he was a former DJ.
I remember WTOB.
Yeah.
See, I was born in 61, so I remember WTOB.
Yeah.
I think it was AAA.
Right.
And that was it.
Oh, it's completely changed. And I knew all these people. But we had Report to the People, which our version of Meet the Press. We interviewed the mayor, the sheriff. By the way, one of the sheriff we used to interview a lot was Manley Lancaster, and he wrote poetry. And his wife, when he passed away, collected it. And I don't know what she did with it, but she did call before he passed away and ask if he could come and read his poems. And he was a pretty good poet.
Wow.
And most people don't know that Manley.
The one that I remember the most of, because during the election, I read up on the sheriffs from Isaac Church was in 1852, and I was reading and I saw where, my memory correct, Ernie Shore.
That's right.
Right, was the longest serving sheriff.
He was in office when I came to Winston-Salem.
Really?
Yeah, so I knew him. I've known every sheriff since I got here.
Wow.
And it's all really interesting. And every sheriff's different.
Yeah, so I read a lot about Ernie Shore and Lancaster Manley. I remember a little bit about him. I've talked to some of the guys and that have retirees, and I always like to hear the history, because one of the things that we want to do around here, I've been talking with Hunter and Christina, is to put together a history of the sheriff's department.
That's a great idea.
Some of the memorabilia, talk with some of the people. Like we have a gentleman, I think he's 80-something years old, retiree, and he was telling me a story about when he would come on to work, they would just switch cars. It was only one car. And the way you would stop someone was you take the flashlight, stick it out the side of the window, and wiggle it.
Really?
Where the light would just kind of wiggle a little bit.
Yeah.
And that's how you would stop people. And I've heard some amazing stories, and that fascinates me to talk about the history. And then here when you said Manley Lancaster, okay, yeah.
And Ernie Shore was a roommate to Babe Ruth.
Really?
Absolutely. He was a baseball player in the major league.
Well, I knew he was a baseball player.
And his roommate was Babe Ruth.
Now, that's the first I heard that. Wow.
Yeah. But all that's interesting to me. Now, Manley was a deputy under Ernie Shore. Most of the people who rose through the ranks and became sheriff were deputies and got their training, in this job. But it's getting back to where I was. Meanwhile, back where Plyler was, I was putting everybody together, trying to make sure I had a program called Shades of Ebony, and there's a girl named what was her name? Jane Farrington. And she interviewed people like Count Basie, the head of the North Carolina NAACP. If there was anybody who was even close to being black with influence in the communities, we had them on our station. But that was one of the things the FCC said you have to do. So I was very fortunate to get that job. And because of that, I substitute a lot for the people. Sometimes Glenn couldn't be there, or sometimes Jane couldn't be there, but I had to report to the people all to myself, and that meant I called people from the newspapers, and we would have newspaper reporters asking questions to the elected officials and that kind of thing. But But what happened was when the time came, I was on Channel 12 for about 8 to 9 hours a week. Wow. We had a program called Channel 12, Camera 12. And my job was to go around and stand on a corner in one of our cities or towns and hold a microphone and ask the question, what do you see as the major problem in your community? And then we would take the answers, edit those down to a 3-minute segment, and that segment would go on the 6 o'clock news Saturday and the news on Sunday, because we didn't have any reporters working, particularly on the weekends, and we needed the time filled. Just
that'd be a good question to ask now. Yeah.
Well, but it was really interesting because we sometimes we get there and be 2 or 3 people.
Yeah.
And that's not enough. On the other hand, we said we were going to be on the corner of whatever street it was in Boone. And half the universe, we had 1,000 people show up.
Up in Appalachian.
And they wanted to talk on camera. So I interviewed everybody that wanted to talk, but we had to take it in all.
Yeah.
I mean, think about this now. You only have 60 seconds in a minute. So if you get one person who talks a minimum of 15 seconds, 1,000 people are not going to get on the air.
No, that won't work.
But they all tuned in, and they're all very happy, and we were happy because the Federal Communications Commission loved it. We put everybody we could find on the air, and it was good for us because that opened a lot of doors for the company and for me. Because by the time it came time to run for office, I decided I wanted to make the effort, and it was back in 1992. Mm-hmm. And I was going to run, but there's a fellow named Wayne Willard who used to be the news director at Channel 12, mm-hmm. and he was chairman of the Forsyth County Board of Commissioners. He and I were friends, and he said, forget about running for commissioner. You can't win. I said, what makes you say that? Because, I've got the name recognition.
And he was your friend?
He's my buddy, yeah.
Okay.
I said, why would you say that? He says, because Jerry Long is running against you.
Now, what do I know as if?
I said, who is Jerry Long? Jerry Long at that time was the chairman of Reynolds Tobacco. And wow. Wayne said, and quite true, he says, Jerry Long has money that you will never, ever see. You can't match him. You can't beat him. And by the way, he's got 14,000 people at R.J. Reynolds that works for him. I thought, well, he's right. So I backed out. I said, okay, I think he's right because you can't match that. I think it was 3 days later I get a call from Jerry Long. I never met him, didn't even know who he was. And he said, I want you to be my campaign manager. I said, I don't know anything about being a campaign manager. He says, well, would you learn with me together and maybe help me? I said, well, sure, I'll be glad to help you. So he says, come up to my office. I went up to his office, and for over a year, I went into Jerry Long's office. Now, that was an experience because Jerry Long's office, as chairman of Reynolds Tobacco, had black, pink, white marble, beautiful, long, white carpet. I mean, if you stepped on that carpet, your foot went into it, and nice furniture.
Where is his office located?
In the Reynolds building, up on I can't think, like the 18th floor.
The Reynolds building, like what is it?
Right next to
Reynolds
the Sheriff's
Department.
Yeah, uh-huh.
Wow.
So I was sitting next to the chairman of Reynolds Tobacco Company, and we were talking about how I was going to be his campaign manager, which it turned out I didn't need to be his campaign manager because he was well known throughout the community. I was the only one that didn't know who Jerry Long was.
I heard the name. Yeah.
Well, he could. There's a YMCA called the Jerry Long
YMCA.
Yeah,
that's where I heard the name.
That's
the Y.
Yeah, that's why, because the Y called Jerry and said, would you be our lead man and raising money? He said, sure. He went out and raised most of the money for what is now the Jerry Long Y, and that's the why they call it Jerry Long.
Yeah.
And Jerry Long also told me, he says, in some of those conversations, he says, now, David, only he called me Davy. Mm-hmm. It was always Davy. 2 things he'd say to me, Davy or Davy, keep your damn mouth shut.
Yeah, yeah.
Good advice, because if I don't say anything, I can't get in trouble.
Right.
And he said, when it came time to run, I told him I was going to run, and he was already on the commission. He says, I'm right here beside you. And he was, where money is concerned, he had plenty of it. I just raised a lot of money because of Jerry Long. All he had to do was call some of the people that work for him at Reynolds. They would call their friends, and the next thing, bingo.
Yeah.
So, I got $15,000, maybe $20,000, and I thought that was a lot of money. Time passes, Jerry passes away, and if I ever grieved over anyone passing away, not because of what he did for me, but because he was an example. He didn't do any. He had a catalog of cuss words that sailors didn't even know, but he didn't get where he was by not doing things for people and mixing it down. So he took care of me, and when the time came, he and I worked together hand in hand. And if you'd told me when I was coming up, as a young man, that I would be working with the chairman of Reynolds Tobacco Company, I'd said it'll never happen, but it did. So when Jerry passed, we had his chief financial officer, I think he hired him, but I don't know for sure, was a fellow named Andrew Gilchrist. And Andrew Gilchrist had the money. He controlled the money and the budget. He knew where the money was. Mm-hmm. He's the one who said we need to form Impact. Impact is now a government, private, public operation to teach third graders how to read. And he said, we've got $40 million at Reynolds. We need to get into the education system, and we've identified third grade reading as one of the key things. So he went to Don Flo and several other community leaders. I think they raised something in the neighborhood of $43 million, formed Impact. Impact makes sure the money is spent properly, but on reading, and that's what's going on right now. I mean, that's the kind of people that we had, and Andrew Gilchrist was the guy that started the whole Impact program.
When was this? What year was this?
About 5 years ago. Long story short on Andrew, he called me one day and he said, now look, Jerry Long from Reynolds became my good friend. I was elected. I think a lot has to do, where I'm concerned, not with the money, but with the very fact my daddy used to say, son, you're judged by the people you associate with. Mm-hmm. And I associated with Jerry Long and his sons. And I got to know his wife. I mean, wow. It was a wonderful time. My wife and I can't. But Andrew, when he called and said, we want to help you, I thought, first it's Jerry Long, who was the chairman at the time of Reynolds. Then it's Andrew Gilchrist, who is the treasurer of Reynolds. He's the chief financial officer. And I ended up 4.5 years ago with $75,000 in the coffer. Remember, I only raised $15 most of the time. That's the most money I'd ever raised. And it took all of it to win it, because we had to buy billboards, because the fellow who was running against me owned the billboard companies. But we had his competition, and it worked very well. But all in all, when it comes right down to it, when I ran for public office, I had friends in high places that I never would have predicted that I would have. I knew all of the elected officials. Mm-hmm. Some of my best friends were the DAs. My wife worked for the district attorney.
I know. I knew your
Don
wife.
Tisdale hired her.
Tisdale.
And he's still here.
Yeah.
And then Jim O'Neill, she knew him. I mean, it's Tom Keith. I can go
Jim
down
O'Neill.
the list.
Of course, yeah.
So if you take the
Cecilia. Yes.
And what's the name of the lady? Loretta Biggs.
Judge Biggs.
Judge Biggs.
Yeah, she's a federal judge
She
now.
was an ADA, and
yes.
Don Tisdale hired her. She worked as an ADA in the DA's office. My wife worked up there.
I know Mr. Tisdale's son. Kenny.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They're all good people.
Yeah, he works down the street down at Grace Tisdale in Clifton.
That's right. Right. So I
see, that's doing my era there. Yeah. See, so I knew Ms. Plyler, your wife, Cecilia, Mr. Tisdale. I remember Mr. Tom Keith.
Oh, yeah.
Warren Sparrow. You remember Mr. Sparrow?
I knew Warren very well. Yes, sir.
Ms. Biggs. Remember Walter Houghton?
Who
was an ADA. Remember
he
him?
worked for Don Tisdale.
He worked for Tisdale.
That's right.
Yeah. Todd worked for him.
Todd Burke will tell you that.
Yes, Todd Burke.
Yeah.
Gosh, I mean, all of them. I'm trying to think who else was over there. He's now a federal prosecutor. I can't think of his name. It's Rob Lane.
He's still there.
Yeah.
And when he got married, there's another one that was
Cliff Barrett.
That's right.
Cliff Barrett.
Cliff Barrett's still there.
Yeah, Cliff, yeah.
And the other guy, he lives in Kernersville, John, I know his first name right off. I can't even, shame it, I can't remember.
Yeah,
but so many people are in the federal judgeships now, or the Superior Court judgeships. It's just, it's all amazing. And people who were in the DA's office, salt of the earth. And by the way, there was a girl named Eunice Ayers. I don't think you remember her.
No, I don't.
Eunice Ayers was registered deeds. She was the longest and had still the record. She served as registered deeds for about 30 years. And one of the things Jerry Long and I used to do is we would discuss. He would always call Eunice Ayers and ask her questions about our conversation. Was this true? Can this be done? Da-da-da-da-da. And she would advise him. And she was always on the money. And we would talk about Eunice Ayers and Jerry's conversation with her the night before. But I mean, and everybody knew Eunice Ayers. And it's just amazing how somehow or another, and I did not set out to do that, but I found out where some of the people that I needed to know were, got acquainted with them quite by accident. I mean, for Jerry Long to call me and ask me to be his campaign manager, I never would have predicted that.
So how long have you been on the board now?
The county commission?
Yes.
Since 1994. So that would be, what, 26 years?
26 years.
It's too long, isn't it?
No. You're legendary. I mean, I'm glad you're there. Me personally, I'm glad you're there. When it's amazing how things that I knew about you, sitting here now, I never knew. Like the history that you just shared with me.
Yeah.
It's amazing. It's amazing. And you and I have talked, had some personal conversation. It's amazing how life bring people together, bring men together.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe from different walks of life, and they've experienced some of the same things in life. It's amazing how, I knew your wife long before I knew you.
Yeah.
And then here I meet you 20-plus years later, I meet you. It's amazing. So I got a question for you. So explain, because a lot of people don't know, what does the county commissioners do? I know what you all do. But
that is the best question you could ask here, because I also got involved in North Carolina politics, but not politics on the state level particularly. Mm-hmm. But I became chairman, president of the North Carolina Association of Counties in Raleigh, mm-hmm. a.k.a. NCACC, and they are the chief lobbying arm for all 100 counties in the state. So I met a lot of commissioners from all over North Carolina, and I still know them, and they're still friends of mine. But when I started out, I didn't know anybody in Raleigh. I had no intention of going to Raleigh, but I learned a lesson there, and one of the lessons was just to drive from here to Raleigh and back every week is something I didn't want to do, but I had to do that to get to be president of the association. So I knew people in Charlotte, and I still do, in Wilmington, in Raleigh, mm-hmm. people who are elected officials and do a lot of good. But the real problem we always had with the NCACC, and we still have here, mm-hmm. is people don't understand what government does. They don't understand there's a difference between cities and counties. For example, if a group of people want to be a city or a town or a village, they sign a petition, make a case for it, go to Raleigh, and Raleigh will approve whatever document it takes to make them a city.
Right.
That's what they do. But they don't do what the county does. The county we don't have a county, a bunch of people that go to Raleigh and say we want to be a county. The General Assembly created the counties. So there are 100 counties in North Carolina, and they're all creations of the Raleigh General Assembly.
Right.
Forsyth County used to be Stokes County. Stokes County covered everything. And there was a time when Guilford County covered more territory than other areas than they do now. So it all works that way. But then when you've got the municipalities, they do certain things. For example, in Winston-Salem, if you have people who are homeless laying on the streets, that's not a county problem. That is a city problem, and they have to take care of it, as you know.
Right.
If the city streets are covered with snow, don't call the county. We won't come and do it. Those are city streets, which means the city takes care of it. And you can, just as an example of how the general public sometimes sees the commissioners. I get calls when it snows from people who say, when are you guys coming out and clean the snow off of our street? And I say no, and then they get upset. And they say, well, what am I paying my taxes for? I say, you're paying your taxes to get the state to come out and do it, and you need to call them. Well, since when has that been? I said, it's always been that way. But that's the way people are. They don't understand it. It's not their fault particularly. And there's a big difference between what the sheriff does and what a police chief does.
Right. So I hear that question all the time is what's the difference between the city and the county?
Yeah.
And I always tell people that the city sits inside the county, therefore the sheriff works in the city.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. But, people say, well, I've heard people say, what do they do? I said, listen, like we have this conversation down at the Sheriff's Associations. When we go to school, all new sheriffs have to go through the Sheriff's Association, new sheriff school. And one of the things that they always tell us is that you want to have a great relationship with your county commissioners. And when we first got there, because, politics was new to me. When I came, I had never ran for an office. Politics was all new to me.
Yeah.
And so when I got there and they was explaining that, listen, that's where you get your money from. That's where your positions come from.
Right.
I said, so you want to make sure that you have a relationship with them. And I thought about that. So I have read more in 2 years, I mean this, than I've read probably in all my life. Because one is this is so new to me that I'm trying to always read. What do they do? What do I do? How does this work? And so when we were sitting down talking and putting our list together of people we wanted to come over here, I said, I want Mr. Plyler over here. I want him over here. Because I remember when I was being sworn in, when I first met you, I was like, I had no idea. Because I was telling us, I didn't know that. And I didn't realize that, okay, this is what the county does and this is what the city does. And you're right, there are a lot of people that don't have a clue of what the county commissioners do, where the budget, that they control the money, the finance, the school, but all these things, people don't have a clue. And so, I try to enlighten them what little bit I know.
Well, I'm going to tell, this is a true story and you know it, but I'm going to tell you what happened with me, where your salary was concerned. This is the honest to God truth. I got a telephone call inviting me and the commissioners to your swearing in. I said, that's good. And then I found out that you weren't sure where your salary was coming from. And it was a city problem. And Vivian Burke, a wonderful woman, she's been in the city council for years. Yeah. But they called me and said, well, now, what are you going to do when the new sheriff wants to have a pay increase? I said, I'm going to tell her to go see Vivian Burke.
I remember that. Listen. Listen. I remember that.
So I got a call I was telling that to our county manager because I said, this is good news. We don't have to pay it anymore. He says, you're not going to get away with that one. So, and fortunately for me, he called you. And
he explained that to me too. And I said, please tell him that I apologize because I had no idea what we were doing and how this is done. I said, this is all new to me. And so he sat me down and, I love Dudley because, he sat me down and he was explaining to me the dynamics, and I was like, I had no idea. I said, this was all new to me.
That was probably the quickest thing you ever learned.
What?
In an instant.
Listen, instant. That was instant learning. That was learning on the spot. What? I said, you mean? Yeah. I said, oh, my God. Yeah.
And the commissioners built this building. We didn't build it. It was the Phillips building, but we paid for it, and we paid to have it remodeled.
Listen, I've learned so much about what the commissioners do, the power that they have. And, we have this thing over here all the time when we sitting around talking. Say, we're going to need some money. We got to go see the commissioners. We got to go over there.
Well, I got to tell you, I'm not. Don't try to misunderstand where I'm coming from. Yeah. But one unnamed commissioner came to me and said, "Look, I know that you think the world of Bobby Kimbrough," and I said, "I do." He said, "Well, quit trying to give him everything."
Listen. Tell the commissioner I think the world of Mr. Plyler. Listen, he ain't trying to give me everything.
That's right.
We're just trying to make the place better. The
That's
county
exactly
better.
Right.
That's it. But you know what? I really enjoy talking to you because we have so much in common. And I've learned, now I'm from Winston-Salem. I was born and raised here.
Do you remember Daddy on the Patio?
Daddy on the Patio, right there on 311.
Well, Jamma Diddy was the Greensboro version of Daddy-O.
See, I got a dog in the east, a dog in the west. If your dog can monkey just like Joe, but can your dog do the monkey like Daddy-O? Do it.
Oh, boy, that's right.
Yeah. Now, I was a little boy. I grew up in East Winston.
Yeah.
I was born in Happy Hill, and I was raised right there on 25th Street, right there near Bloom Park. And so as a little boy growing up, we used to go back and forth to Winston Lake, and my dad used to take me out to Winston Lake Golf Course and pick up golf balls and go out there with him and just walk behind him while he hit golf balls. And so I was raised here. I was born here, and I thought I knew a lot of the history of Winston-Salem. I left here in '79 going away to school to Pfeiffer down in Meisenheimer.
Which Jerry Long was the chairman of the board, incidentally, at Pfeiffer.
At Pfeiffer College?
Yeah, sure was, yeah.
You know what?
That's probably where you heard the name.
That's where I heard the name.
Yeah, that's right.
Wow.
Isn't that interesting?
Wow. That's true.
It's true, absolutely, yeah.
So Tom Childress, who was the basketball coach down there, Mike Epps, who went down there before I got there, who introduced me to Tom Childress, Olin Schuler. So I end up at Pfeiffer. I come back, take a job with the police department years later and so forth, and I go away to work for the DEA. And so I thought I knew a lot of history, but sitting here, I never knew that the Gray family owned the Journal and the Sentinel and the TV station.
That's right, all of it.
But I knew who the Gray family was because if I'm not mistaken, my dad went to a Gray high school or Gray school or something.
It was the same family.
Okay,
yeah.
I've heard of the Gray family. I definitely have heard of them, but I did not know that they owned all the things that they own. I knew they were a very prominent family here.
Oh, for years it was the Bowman Gray School of Medicine.
The Bowman Gray School of Medicine. Bowman Gray track over here. Yeah.
That's all the same family.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And he was interesting. I don't mean to interrupt, but there's one thing about Mr. Gray where I was concerned.
Yeah.
When I worked in Greensboro, there was no union. We made very low wages.
Yeah.
And I worked, I guess, I could work 60, 80 hours a week, but I'd still get the same amount of money. When I came over here, Mr. Gray, not the management, not the state, not the unions, it was Mr. Gray said we need to have a union at Channel 12. And that was unheard of. But the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers did become the union, which means when I came from Greensboro over here, I worked 40 hours a week. I got time and a half over 40. I got double time on holidays. I got 2 consecutive days off. And if I got off tonight at 6, I couldn't be brought in until 1 minute after 6 the next day. I got 12 hours off in between schedules. But that was union, and it meant a lot to us because, gosh knows, we got paid probably more money working for Mr. Gray at WSJS, now WXII, than any of the, except for maybe Charlotte, WBT in Charlotte, or WPTF in Raleigh. But the 3 stations were alike because they paid big wages, and that meant a lot to me. Still does.
Well, Ms. Plyler, I want you to know this. I want you to know how much I appreciate you. I want you to know how much I appreciate your service to this community, this county. You're my friend. I love you. I appreciate everything you do for us to try to make us better servants over here, make us better stewards. Your support that you've given me, you've given this whole in this county.
I'll continue to do that. Yeah.
And I appreciate that. I want you to know you're welcome to come back here anytime. If you ever need us for anything, we're here. And I want to thank you. And I want to give you the last word. Anything you want to say, anything you want to leave us with, because I know you're a plethora of knowledge. Now, that I do know.
I like to talk, that's all.
Yeah, but you know what? I could go on talking to you for a while because I had no idea some things that you talked about. The Woolworth incident that you were sharing with me. Yeah. I had no idea. We've talked about the Gray family, the Bowman Gray family, Manley Lancaster. It's so many things. I tell you what happened to me one day, right? So I go to, this was last year now, this is after I'm in office. So I go to a fundraiser here in Winston-Salem for someone else. They invited me to come by. So I go to this house, beautiful home, and I'm just looking around like they got statues inside the house. This is way above my normalcy, and I'm saying, wow, whose house is this? So Miss Fry, Susan, comes in the door, and I said, Susan, whose house is this? She said, you don't know whose house you're in? I said, no, you just sent me an address, and I just showed up and started shaking hands and said hello. She said, this is the Brenner's family. And I say, well, who are they, right? And so she gave me an education, not an education, but she gave me an education on who they were. And I say, so days later, I say, well, let me share something with you. I say, well, see, growing up on 25th Street, right there in front of Bloom Park, I didn't see them every day, right? I didn't know that. I thought that was just a name that somebody came up with. I had no idea that it was the same people, Hospital Steel and all that. And so now the same thing applies. You talking about the Gray family. I had no idea that they own, not only did they own TV stations, radio and all of that. Newspapers. I always thought that the Journal and Sentinel, and I always thought that the TV station was a subsidiary of NBC.
Nope.
But
Mr. Gray owned it all.
Yeah, I see that. I see that.
He's a little short guy.
Really?
Yeah, if you met him, you'd never know he had everything.
Wow.
But he also loved his people. I mean, he took care of us. It was a great, every time I had 2 daughters, and every time I had a daughter born, I'd get a silver cup with the date of the birth on it and a little note from him. And, you know, he had hundreds of people working for him.
So were you in Winston when they imploded the
I was there, the Robert E. Lee Hotel.
Robert E. Lee Hotel.
I was the news director at Channel 12, and we had seven 16-millimeter
It's where
cameras.
the Embassy Suite sits, right?
That's right. And we blew it, you know, they imploded it.
Exactly.
And we had it at the Baptist Church. We had it in the convention center. We had them surrounded it. And we would blow it up and implode it, and then we'd build it back up, and we'd blow it up and build it back up. That was a big deal.
Now, see, I remember that.
Yeah.
I remember that. See, yeah, I remember that. There's a few things around here that I remember, you know, from growing up.
Well, I bet you probably remember Velma Hopkins.
I do.
Velma Hopkins was in league with Maisie Woodruff.
I remember Miss Woodruff.
And there's one other lady. There are 3 of them. And they would meet to determine what they were going to complain about to the commissioners.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what they did. Every time the commissioners met, those 3 women showed up. And when the public session came, they'd stand up and complain about whatever they wanted to. And there was a guy, I can't remember his name. He was killed on Christmas Day. He was riding a motorcycle back from Stokes County, got rear-ended by a pickup truck and died. And he was chairman of the board at that time. And when Thelma and Maisie showed up, he offered them an opportunity. But it primarily went to Thelma because she was not a diplomat. She just tell it like it was. Yeah. And he offered her the cafeteria at the Reynolds Health Center, which was over in where the DSS and
on Highland Avenue. Yeah.
And she took it on the condition she not come back.
Don't show back up.
She never came back. And if she came in there, she wanted to know if they needed any food or whatever. Yeah. But it wasn't. And she respected them. They respected her. And Maisie ran for the office and was elected to the board. So some seriously good stories. And we used to have, back in that day, there was a black minister named, I shouldn't have brought that up because I know him as well as I know my own name. But he was always the guy who kind of got it started, a preacher now. And then Velma would come in and Maisie would come in. And Mr. Russell, who owned the funeral home, was he was the vice mayor at the time.
Yeah, I know the Russells well. Cedric, all of them, right. Cedric, Carmen.
Well, after you were sworn in, I guess it was his son.
It was Cedric.
Yeah, he swears by you. He thinks you're the greatest guy that ever lived.
No. Cedric is like you to me. Me and Cedric, I've known Cedric for a while.
Yeah.
And I knew that's a whole nother story. But anyway, I knew who the Russells were.
Yeah.
I knew them. They had buried several family members of mine. And they buried my wife. And that's when me and Cedric clicked. And we really sat down and talked.
Yeah.
And we became friends after that. And I would go by there and help him out at the funeral home. I'd drive to Virginia, pick up bodies for him. This was after I had retired. I had plenty of time on my hand. And Cedric. I know the Russells, and I know the story about his dad running for office and all that.
And he won.
Yeah. Wow. Anything you want to say before we go? Because I could talk to you forever.
Yeah,
'cause you know
I
what?
could too.
The more we talk, we started to know some of the same people.
That's right.
And I'm starting to catch up because now you're coming into my era where I can remember, because, from the 60s and coming forward about 70 is when I started saying, okay, I can remember that. I know that person. Yeah.
Well, I'm getting up there in age. I'm 81 years old now, and I never thought I'd reach that age, but
My
I'm
father
there.
is 82.
Well, that makes me old enough to be your dad.
Yeah,
But the
father's
bottom line
82.
where I'm concerned is I've never had the opportunity to talk one-on-one. If I talked with anybody, especially from the Sheriff's Department, it was either at the Commissioner's office or in front of a television camera at Channel 12, and it was always a formal meeting.
Yeah.
But you're the only elected official, and I don't say this lightly, that I feel like I've known all my life, and I respect you, and I think the best thing that ever happened to this county is when you were elected.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
And to have a guy that really respects the law. And by the way, I have an opportunity to talk to a lot of deputies, and the morale over here is just sky high.
I love this place.
I
say it all the time. I don't know when to go home in the evenings. I've been through a lot of things in my life, and I've shared with some of the people. I just love. I'm at a place in my life where I just want to help people, and sometimes it gets me in trouble. I went through some things in my life, and I made a promise to God: if you do this or help me do this, this is what I'll do. I'll serve you, and I'll serve the people.
I absolutely believe that after hearing you speak in church.
Yeah, I don't. I've seen a lot of things in my life. All I ask God for in my life now is to let me see my last two boys become adults and sufficient and on their own. I've done most of the things I wanted to do in life, things I've never imagined. I never imagined I'd be sitting here talking to you. I never imagined I'd be sitting in the office of the people, the sheriff's office. My goal was I wanted to be like Jim West, O'Connor on the Wild Wild West show, Dr. Lovelace and Artemis Gordon. I always wanted to be Jim West, and that was my dream in life, to be an agent. And then I just wanted to sit down and fade off into the sunset. But I never knew God had other plans for me. So I thank you for your support. I thank the people. Stop by anytime, and as always, you're my friend.
Thank you, sir.
Make that a fact.
I appreciate that.
Enjoyed you, and thank you for watching us. And next time till we talk again, Off the Cuffs today was with Mr. Plyler, the chairman of the Forsyth County Commissioners, and myself, Bobby. Thank you.